Well, my final segment was the solutions suggested to the situation in Australia. That we have a situation where government is failing. And one of the areas where I think we have agreed on air that the very safeguards which we expected to operate in relation to problems like the virus failed in relation to the virus, as Will mentioned, Will Jeffries mentioned. The things that should have happened did not happen. For example, normally a second chamber, and all jurisdictions have a second chamber except Queensland. Normally, a second chamber can deal with excesses by the government in relation to regulations. Most of what has been imposed as a result of the virus in Australia has been done under delegated legislation or under regulations. That is not primary legislation by the Parliament, but delegated legislation. All of the parliaments of Australia allow the second chamber, the upper house, to take action, to disallow regulations. We have, for example, this regulation which stops us from travelling. We almost have a blanket rule that nobody in Australia can travel unless they're a Prime Minister or other politician, or unless there has to be a very solid case.
Or sport people.
Yes, to get out of the country. When you look at the primary legislation which authorises that, it says that the purpose of the regulatory power is to stop us from spreading the disease overseas. It's to stop Australians. That's the power the minister has, to regulate, to control us from travelling, to stop us from spreading the disease overseas. The way to do that, I would have thought, would be to say, well, have a test before you go. Produce a test showing you don't have it, and then you can travel. But no, we have this almost blanket rule that ordinary Australians involved in ordinary matters like tourism can't go outside of the country. That is obviously, if somebody tested in court, it's obviously beyond the power that Minister Hunt has. Still, he's done it. Nobody's gone to court to challenge it. Not anybody sufficiently significant has gone to court about it. So, but no second, the Senate has not disallowed that, unless the Senate gave away its power to do this in the legislation, and I'm not sure whether that's there. Then there's the power of the courts to rule on this. Well, the courts have shown a reluctance to stand up. The High Court, for example, doesn't seem to be terribly interested in enforcing Section 92. None of the state closures could be justified, surely, on health grounds, yet the High Court has allowed them to proceed. And so one of the other things, and Will mentioned, one would have thought that the reserve powers extend to viceroys advising premiers and prime ministers that they think that they are breaching the law in relation to regulations being adopted. These regulations should have gone, I would have thought, to the Executive Council. There's a lot of legislation in Australia now which allows the ministers directly to make subordinate legislation. It doesn't have to go to the Executive Council. There would be an advantage in going to the Executive Council because, as Sir Guy Green said, the purpose of the Executive Council is for the governor to say, well, is there a power to do this? Are there any conditions on that power? And have those conditions been fulfilled? So there's a chance in the Executive Council doing that. But that also failed. All of the restrictions, and we have had, I think effectively in Australia, tin pot dictators using the epidemic to do things which are clearly beyond power and not necessary to control the epidemic. So my question to you in that very roundabout way, because again I'm talking too much, usually talking, my question to you is what solutions do you think we should adopt?
Well, everything you said sounded pretty good, David. But no, the one thing I would add would be that we've got to abolish this national cabinet. I think that's consolidated far too much power and it's not even a real cabinet. I mean, I don't even know if it would have the traditional cabinet powers, but they call it a cabinet, and so therefore they think it can have cabinet in confidence dictates and whatnot. Look, a lot of what's occurred is simply based off medical advice. I can't see why that's confidential. I mean, it affects all of us. Take the state border closures, which you mentioned. I think in the early days, maybe there was a case to shut down just but now we know what's going on. I mean, the situation with Queensland has had a lot of attention because it's been around an election, but the situation in Western Australia is worse, and it's intolerable. And, you know, Mark McGowan's enjoying popularity of about 87% in the opinion polls over there, so he'll carry on until he's told that he cannot. And to his credit, at least Clive Palmer tried. He had his own reasons, but he tried to test all of this under Section 92, and I think failed. When the High Court finally got around to dealing with the matter, there wasn't a real sense of expediency in the legal system for some reason. But to go back to where I started, this National Cabinet, I think, has allowed far too much secrecy around decisions which affect all of our lives. We are at war, but with a virus, not with an army with tanks and spies. And in other words, the old adage of loose lips sinking ships just doesn't apply with a virus. You can let the public know the medical advice on which you as a state premier, for example, or a prime minister are relying without the virus sort of hearing it and changing its tactics. And yet many politicians have revelled in this secrecy. As Chris Uhlmann from Channel 9, and I think he's done some very good coverage on this, as he pointed out, that sort of embedded authoritarian streak in every politician's DNA has just been allowed to let rip. You know, they've put the fertiliser on it, watered it, and away it's grown, you know, and just call it COVID. And the tragedy, and we're talking here about things that could be done or changed, but the tragedy is that we, the people, have been complicit in this as well. There's been, of course, not yourself and probably not the people in this room, but there's been a lot of people that have just been willing to say, oh, well, and let it happen. And, you know, once upon a time, Australia was seen as a country of people that had a bit of a rebellious streak. They could be loyal to the crown, and they could, but they nonetheless thought for themselves, and they weren't led around the nose like the prize bull at the Easter show. But during COVID, a lot of people have been happy to be taken around the ring and more than once.
Just on that, if I may.
It's absurd.
I get the impression, particularly from the television media, that the journalists seem to have seen their function not to be to question in any way, but rather to rearrange the press releases. And they would often come out saying, and people have to do the right thing. In other words, obey the government.
Oh, we're all in this together.
We're all in this together. Yours was one of the few spots where there was an independent voice. And do you find that the media are seen to be the fifth estate? They are part of our structure. They're not formally in the Constitution, although we have an understanding that there is freedom of the media, that is part of the common law, and the Americans put it into the Constitution. But they are a structural part of the way in which the democracy is supposed to function. And I think this has failed in this regard.
In large part, yes, I would agree. And it's interesting, when you put a counterpoint of view to the public, it doesn't take them very long and they realise, oh yeah, there's probably some truth to that. Yeah, but people have just been bombarded from March, really, with one line of thought. And that I've found, I have to say, to repeat, I mean, I've found the public's willingness just to accept, not in any way trying to cause uprisings and not, but just the willingness not even to question the validity of some of the decisions, extraordinary. I mean, you take, for example, the recent rulings to do with outdoor gatherings. And so you can have 30 people in your backyard, but small restaurants with 200 square metres can have X, but Venues with 204 square metres can have Y. Why the difference? And then, of course, if you want to have a Christmas carol outside, well, as long as everybody over the age of 12 wears masks, they can all sort of mumble along behind cotton. But the under 12, apparently, they don't need to wear a mask. Why? But you can still have a concert of 3,000 people. So based off that logic, the Christians are 6 times more likely to get COVID than the heathen who's going to Led Zeppelin. Now, I mean, who dreams this up? And then, of course, in Queensland, without wanting to get prude, there was all sorts of rules about swingers parties. I mean, they'd even gone into this sort of minute detail about randoms catching up together and having it safely, COVID speaking. I mean, what sort of public servant even thinks about that? Maybe we know what they get up to, but we're learning about them during this pandemic. But just every detail of life through this prism of COVID has now been regulated. And, bit by bit, some are coming off, but will they all come off? And next time around, will we learn the lessons? I think that's the big question.
In a book that Jai Martinez, who's in the audience, and I wrote a few years ago called Give Us Back Our Country, we pointed out that the move to federation would not have occurred, it stopped, because it broke down because the politicians could not agree. Once the convention had come to a constitution, it was sent back to the colonial parliaments who wanted to refight it. And they could never agree, and it was at Corowa where Sir John Quick made the proposal which became the Corowa Plan, which was give it to the people. Have a convention directly elected by the people. Once they've come to a conclusion as to the Constitution, having consulted the politicians and the people, once they've come to that conclusion, put that to the people. In other words, it was a solution. To get federation in this country, it had to be handed over to the people, taken away from the politicians. And what we proposed in that book is that the present malaise, and it is a terrible malaise, present malaise can best be answered by putting it to the people. Call a convention, have the people at the convention come up with solutions, and I've evolved that into a provision in the Constitution for regularly calling a convention if the people want to, and there are ways in which that could then be solved in the sense of introducing much more democracy into the body politic.
There just have to be a convention that is unlike the 2021 that Kevin Rudd called. We have to say no butcher's paper, no black pens, no sitting on the floor.
If it were elected, would it be different from Kevin inviting all his elite
the actors?
You have to really hand it to the people, to the rank and file, don't you? Because that's where, I mean, just if you listen, and many of you do, if you listen to Michael's programs, you'll find that the great bulk of the listeners are obviously part of this very sensible rank and file, people who've had a real life, people who've worked, who've had businesses, who have a much greater common sense that seems to be present among the politicians, or that they will admit to be present.
Indeed.
Is that the solution, you think?
Yes. To go full circle, yes. Greater inclusion of the public, garner, farm that collective wisdom, and put it into legislation to strengthen the country.